Welcome to episode 7 of The 6 Shifts with Jan Birkins and Kari Yates, co-authors of Shifting the Balance, 6 Ways to Bring the Science of Reading into the Balanced Literacy Classroom, published by Stenhouse. In today's episode, Jan and Kari, with Stenhouse's Dan Tobin, discuss the final shift, Reconsidering Texts for Beginning Readers.
Welcome back to our podcast series. We've arrived at the 6th and final shift from the book, Shifting the Balance. It seems like a good time to step back and reflect on the idea of shifts. What do you actually mean by a shift?
Well, Dan, when things aren't working or they're not working quite as well as you wish they were, you might just ask yourself, what is it that needs to shift in this moment? Where can I shift in order to get a change? Any educator who is honest with themselves can see that there is room for improvement in our literacy outcomes with students. And so when Kari and I decided to tackle this project, that's really the question we had in mind. What needs to shift in our early literacy practices?
And we wanted to understand, why is there so much pushback on some of the things we have held so dear? Chapter 6 topic is certainly an example of one that strikes at the heart and soul of balanced literacy practices. And this chapter, I think, invites a really important shift, or you could call it adjustment, calibration, alignment, about something that more and more literacy educators are talking about, and that is the kind of texts that we choose to use with our most beginning readers.
Now, in the first podcast I did with the two of you, I asked you about the order of the chapters and why you started with reading comprehension.
Yeah.
And now I'm interested in asking, why do you end the book with text selection? I know that both of you care a great deal and have written a lot about the importance of selecting the right text. Why does this come at the end of the book? Is there an intention behind that?
Yes, absolutely, Dan.
Yeah.
Great question. We did, in fact, purposely position this topic as very last for a couple of reasons. First, it draws on understandings built across the whole book. That really chapter 6 makes sense with the support of chapters 1 through 5. You have to come to chapter 6 with an understanding of how the reading brain really works and how orthographic knowledge accumulates.
Yeah, and another reason that we positioned this chapter last is exactly what you said, Dan. It's that we do believe text selection is really kind of at the heart and soul of successful literacy instruction. And we think of texts as the primary toolkit in a teacher's bag of tricks. And so text selection for the beginningest readers, though, it turns out is both more delicate and even more critical, we think, in a number of ways. And so we tackle those here in chapter 6.
And what are some of the misunderstandings that have developed despite our teachers' best intentions of choosing text carefully and thoughtfully? What are some of the misunderstandings that get in the way of instruction for beginning readers that's of the most effective instruction we could have?
Well, we'll just start with the first misunderstanding in the chapter, Dan, and that's that decodable texts are loaded with problems. And everyone, regardless of whether they align with, quote unquote, the science of reading or quote unquote balanced literacy, we can all see the truth in this statement. There are some really there's some horrible decodable texts out there. Unfortunately, there are also some terrible pattern texts out there. There are just, in general, some really poorly designed, poorly written beginning reading texts. So the question really is, how do we find excellent beginning reading texts for readers? And the decodable versus predictable question is really a matter of degrees, because every text has some degree of decodability and some degree of predictability. So we'll definitely understand the concern about decodable texts, but we're certainly not ready to decide that none of them are worth our attention.
And I think there again, because this chapter builds on the previous chapters, by the time you arrive at chapter 6, we hope that you have lots of reason to sort of open your heart in new ways to the power of decodable text. And I think we also want to highlight Misunderstanding 4. And that is that as long as kids are just spending time with books every day, they're going to become better readers. And although we know that high volume reading is so important for all readers, and we are strong advocates of both choice and independent reading, again, especially for the most beginning readers, it's not just about how much time beginning readers spend reading that matters. It's also about what they are reading. And kind of think about it as like if in the beginning, when kids are just learning the sort of rules of the road for reading, we need to do whatever we can to make sure that those early experiences align with and kind of even shore up what they're learning, rather than confuse students further or confuse those early phonics principles that they're working. I mean, we want texts that will help them to verify what they're learning in their phonics lessons, to sort of internalize and be able to successfully use that orthographic filing system that they're working so hard to build in ways that will ultimately contribute to fluency and comprehension down the line. So it's sort of like more care with early texts will ultimately pay off in terms of the kinds of texts kids are able to read later and maybe even sooner as a result of the early care that we take.
What are one or two actions you would expect teachers to take on after reading chapter 6?
Well, it's likely that in many cases, we've over-relied on predictable pattern text to get kids quickly up in reading, or at least that's our intention. And yet in doing so, we may actually have made things slower and more difficult for kids. And this chapter draws heavily on understandings built in the previous chapters, as we have mentioned a couple of times, but it challenges us to reconsider the kinds of texts we put in front of beginning readers. And, we refer to aligned texts, and you'll have to kind of read the chapter. It's more than we can go into here, but texts that really align with where the kids are as readers.
And again, the chapter doesn't only challenge current practices or explain the science. It does that in the first half, but in the second half, it really follows up with concrete actions, instructional routines, and just thoughtful adjustments we can make as we shift our practice and make sure that we open up literacy more easily for children in those early years of school.
And we do have at the6shifts.com, there are a number of downloadables there, but one in particular is a series of questions or tensions to consider as you're evaluating beginning reading texts. And it's a nice complement as you study the book.
I'm just, as I listen to you, thinking of the idea that out of struggle, the pleasure of realization is all that much intensified. The struggle is important, and the struggle you went through and the struggle teachers and students will go through. But on the other side, isn't there a real sense of satisfaction you get as you work through that change of practice and that change of thinking and come out the other side? Is that somewhat what you experienced, Kari, in your journey from the hard no to the hard yes?
Absolutely. And I really believe what you're saying personally. In fact, I have in my pile of things that hang on the wall in my house that are currently being reordered because we're getting ready for a move. Out of difficulties come miracles. I really believe that. But the other thing that's really on my mind as you're saying that is, whatever we've done in our classrooms, we've done with the best of intentions to help kids. And however we've gotten early readers started, we want them to be readers. And so lots of what we've done in the name of trying to make it easier to get started. But it actually turns out the same is true for readers, that they have to be able to struggle. So looking at that picture and being able to maybe figure it out serves a child in the moment, but it's actually that struggle with the print a little bit of doing that cognitive work that starts to build that orthographic understanding and that orthographic knowledge. And so that is actually an aha that we've really come to, is that we've got to be willing to be with kids and help them dig in and do that work.
I think too, like just in terms of our working through this project, certainly the struggle of a project under a condensed timeline during a pandemic in a writing partnership that was new, certainly coming out on the other side of that, proud of the product, having done what was hard in some moments and kind of through the fire, I guess. They say it's always, what is it? I don't like to write, but I like to have written. After the fact, certainly it does feel gratifying and satisfying. But some of the walking through the fire, there were some moments. But it does make, I think, the ending sweeter.
Well, Thank you for writing the book, for doing the website, and for sitting with us here for these interviews. They've been really interesting and eye-opening. I think they're a good preview into the book.
It's been our pleasure to be able to walk through this book with you and the listeners, and we're truly excited about continuing this conversation.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dan.
Shifting the Balance: 6 Ways to Bring the Science of Reading into the Balanced Literacy Classroom by Jan Berkins and Kari Yates is available from Stenhouse Publishers. Follow Jan Berkins online at Dr. Jan Berkins and www.drjanberkins.com. Follow Kari Yates at Kari_Yates. And be sure to check out www.the6shifts.com. We hope you enjoyed listening to The 6 Shifts with Jan Berkins and Kari Yates. Future episodes will look more closely at each shift. We'd love to hear your feedback. Get in touch with us at marketing@stenhouse.com. And please share this with your colleagues who you think would enjoy it too. Thanks for listening.